Good morning, everyone. I welcome you all for the third day workshop on a webinar program on beginners course in web programming. Now, I would like to request Mr. Amogh to take over the session.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay, good morning, all. Welcome to the third day of the web programming workshop. Right. Over the last 2 days, we learned about HTML, we learned about CSS, and how we can use these two together in order to build. A basic website, right? So today we're going to be taking a look at something a little bit different, right? We're going to be taking a look at something called as JavaScript. Now, JavaScript, like I've mentioned before, is one of the programming languages that is used together with HTML and CSS in order to create a fully fledged website, right? With HTML, you can, I've mentioned this before, with HTML, you have the content part of it. With the CSS, you can control how the presentation of that content is, displayed. And what we can do with JavaScript is what we'll be exploring today, okay? So JavaScript adds dynamic functionality to a website, right? Now, so far, we've taken a look at HTML and CSS, right? We built a very basic website for a cafe that's going to be opening soon in Mysuru, right? What we've done so far with that is, just put out a few images, put out a few headings, a little bit of content that says that talks a little bit about the cafe and, what their offerings are. But there's nothing special about it so far, right? There's nothing, that you can use in order to add some sort of dynamic functionality to the website, right? Like, what do I mean by dynamic here, right? Dynamic simply means that, let's imagine that you are, watching a TV show, for example, right? Now, the TV show that you're watching will probably be the same. I mean, whatever content you watch on the TV show will probably be the same for someone else that is watching it, right? There's going to be no major changes, right? The script is going to remain the same. The actors and the dialogue and everything is going to remain the same, right? There's going to be no change. But let's take the example of, something like, for example, a weather forecast, right? Now, if you're watching a weather forecast on TV, the people in Mysore see a different weather forecast, right, compared to the people that see a weather forecast in Bangalore, right? The weather report on that comes on TV, has all the same elements. There is a reporter that's talking, but the reporter is different in different places, right? The place itself is different. If it's in Bangalore, then they'll be showing the weather of different places in Bangalore. If it's Mysore, they'll be showing the weather of different places in Mysore, right? So if you consider it in that particular fashion, in that particular sense, then you can say that that weather is dynamic, right? So the HTML website that we've built so far is completely static, right? There is no information that changes. There is nothing that we are actually changing, to personalize the experience for the user. Okay, so JavaScript is mainly used for that. Okay, now JavaScript has been around for a long time. JavaScript was first introduced in 1995 by a person called Brendan Eich. Okay, there's a little bit of a story here behind this because, the early 1990s were that particular era in computer science when there were lots of things happening, right? I mean, we saw the launch of HTML in 1993, right? People could now share documents very easily with one another over something called as the internet, right? And then in 1996, we saw the launch of cascading style sheets, or CSS. We looked at CSS yesterday, right? And it solved a lot of the problems that HTML initially had and that couldn't be solved as easily, right? So, we have Java, we have HTML, and we have CSS now. Okay, and we can change how the presentation of that HTML document is going to be like, right? But there was an immense need at that particular time, for especially for businesses that were getting on the internet, right? That were displaying things on the internet, like for example their portfolio, or maybe their vision and mission statements, or probably something along the lines of information like a knowledge base or something along those lines. uh, they felt the need for having something of a more customized experience, right? So in the early 90s, everyone wanted to go out and do the best. They wanted to go out and create the best thing that they could do in the web development domain, right? So we had another very popular programming language at that point of time that was released in 1995 as well. This is called Java, right? And this was developed by Sun Microsystems. And, everybody wanted, to learn Java, to use Java. And Sun Microsystems themselves wanted Java to be adopted, right? But, back at that point in time, at 1993, 1994, 1995, we didn't have Google Chrome, or we didn't have Mozilla Firefox, or we didn't have any of the other browsers that you know and use today, right? We only had one browser. We had something called as Netscape Navigator. It was the most popular browser. There were other offerings, yes, but Netscape Navigator was probably the most popular of the lot. We didn't have Internet Explorer at that point of time yet, right? So Netscape Navigator, so Netscape felt, the company behind the browser, they felt that there needed to be a programming language that was created, that would complement HTML, right? And they hired a person called Brendan Eich. And Brendan Eich was tasked with creating a totally new programming language that could be used to interact and make HTML dynamic. And the best part of this entire story is that he sat down over a period of 10 days, okay, and he launched the initial version of JavaScript, which continued for the next few years, right? So that's some amazing, achievement right there. So, JavaScript is so popular. It's been 25 years since JavaScript was launched. And even today, JavaScript is probably one of the most popular programming languages, right? I mean, it just took off when it launched in 1995. JavaScript was probably one of those languages that saw unprecedented, popularity right out of, right on the day of its launch. Lots of people started using it, and the main reason that they started using it, and the main reason that it is still used today, is because it is very easy to, use JavaScript. Okay. JavaScript is used to build today, right? Today, JavaScript is used to build some of the most popular applications that we use on a day-to-day basis. We love and use Facebook, right? Facebook has their own implementation of JavaScript, in fact, which is called React.js, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But Facebook uses JavaScript. Google Search uses JavaScript. YouTube uses JavaScript. Swiggy, that's another popular app that you might know of. They use JavaScript. Whenever you open any of these applications or these web pages on the browser, you will see that they use JavaScript extensively in order to give that dynamicity to the user. So I'd just like to take a moment out at this point of time and kind of go over to the reason why we need JavaScript, right? Why is it exactly that why can't we just do whatever we're doing, the dynamic element in HTML? Well, one part of the problem is that HTML does not have it does not have any means for us to allow us to do that. Even if there were, there is one single workaround. Okay, let's take a very simple example, right? Let's imagine that when you want to visit the website, you want your name to show up right at the top. For example, hi, your name. Good morning. Here is the news updates for today. Let's imagine that you're visiting a website that shows all the recent news articles, right? And if you want it to be dynamic, right, the your name part that comes on top at the starting of the page needs to be taken as an input from you, right? And then it needs to show up there. But the thing is, let's imagine that there are about 200 people that are using it. So just for the first page alone, right, the main page, you would have to create 200 different versions if you're just using HTML, right? Which kind of becomes very hectic. If you have a website that has 40 to 50 pages or even more pages, that's probably one of the primary reasons why there was a need for an external programming language that would not make HTML heavy, but would also just be used when it was needed, right? And that's the reason why we use JavaScript. Okay. In modern times, however, JavaScript has moved on from being just JavaScript, right? We have several different implementations of it. We have, the original JavaScript, which is called ECMA Script 5, version 5, right? That is the original form of JavaScript. But there is another form of JavaScript that is being used very, very much today. There is a need for developers that know the newer form of JavaScript, and every major application that you see that is launching today, every single one of them use one of these newer versions of JavaScript. All the newer versions of JavaScript are based on something called as ECMA Script 6, right? ECMA Script version 6. And it's not that different from the first version of JavaScript, but it is different enough that it merits its own separate programming language, and it's a set of rules that go along with it. Right? It introduces a lot of new features. It overcomes a lot of the limitations that JavaScript had, and it just makes JavaScript very, very simple overall when compared to the older version of JavaScript. Right? So some of these newer versions of JavaScript you might have heard of. Right? They some of them are called Angular. One of them is called Angular. Then there is one that is created by Facebook, and this is called React. By the way, Angular is created by Google, right? Then there is something called as Vue.js, which is another version or another take on one of these frameworks that uses JavaScript at its core and makes it easy for people. And then probably one of the most popular variations of JavaScript is called jQuery, and you might have heard of this. This is very old. Like, it was released very, very, very early, in the days of the web. And jQuery has been used extensively to create, before Angular, React, and Vue were there, jQuery was used to create some of the most complex websites on the internet. Okay. Okay, now I've spoken a little bit about the history and where we are right now with JavaScript, but what is it that JavaScript can do? Is there something that does JavaScript offer something that does JavaScript offer something that other languages don't? Well, yes. I just like to go a little bit a little bit of reasons for what JavaScript can do, right? So I have an example laid out here, right? So one thing that it can do is change the content of the HTML. Okay, let's. So this is actually a p tag, or this is a heading tag, right? Let's the text that says let's change this text by clicking the button below, right? And if I click on this button, this text that is being highlighted right now will change, right? So I'll just demo that for you, and there we go. It just changed to hello JavaScript. So this is one of the things that JavaScript can do, right? This makes it very, very easy when you're trying to build a dynamic website, right? Let's take the example from before when I said that, if you want to welcome a user by their name, with their name, then this is how you would go about doing it, right? You would probably store their name somewhere, right? In a place that is easy to access. And then whenever they visit the website, you just say, hello, good morning, and put the name of the user. And this way you can have just one HTML page, but then keep changing it based on who's visiting it on the fly, right? So that is kind of what JavaScript can do. Now, one of the other things that JavaScript can also do is, and this is something that we are very much interested in, it can change CSS properties, right? So we have spoken about CSS, and a CSS property is what allows us to set or change the style of certain things, certain HTML tags. For example, we can change the text color of a HTML tag, right? So I have an example laid out here again, right? We have, we have this text that says, let's change the color of this to red, right? And if I click on this button, it's going to change the color of this text to red, okay? and there we go. It changed the color to red, right? So this comes very much in handy when we want to change certain things, certain styles on the fly. Okay, let's imagine, for example, that there is some mathematical computation that needs to be done for a certain element, right? For example, we need to see what the width of the screen that the user is viewing the website in is, right? And take that width and probably divide it by 2 in order to set the width of that particular element, right? Now CSS does not offer very much in terms of mathematical computations, right? And it does not allow us to easily do so, in fact, even if it does. So this is probably one of the easiest ways that you can go about achieving that thing, right? And I just showed you an example of changing the text color to red here, but you can go ahead and change just about any CSS property that exists using JavaScript, right? One other thing that it can do is it can hide HTML elements, right? So for example, I have this heading over here that says, let's hide this heading, right? And I have a button that says hide heading. So if I click on that button, it's going to hide this, right? If I click on that, it's going to remove that entire thing. You will not see that at all. So let's go ahead and do that. There you go, right? So that no longer exists. It doesn't, I can't see it anymore, right? Now this comes in handy when you are trying to build a dynamic website. Let's imagine that you have a website, okay, that has a login system, and the same website also offers content for both logged in and for non-logged in users, right? Now, this website will display some things, in detail for people that are logged in, right? For example, it could display, personalized instructions for how to build a computer, for example, right? And you probably don't want people to see that unless and until they're logged in. Probably you have some sort of a paid plan where people can come, they can pay you so much money, and then they can sign up for an account, and they'll be able to get the information that they're after, right? And this comes very much in handy when we're dealing with situations like that. So we can just check if the user is logged in or not, and if they're logged in, we show them the normal thing. But if they're not logged in, we hide it, right? So that's how you can go about achieving that with JavaScript. So I've spoken a little bit about what JavaScript can do, right? Some of the things that JavaScript can be used for. But where exactly do you write this JavaScript code? Now, if you remember our CSS guide or a CSS workshop from yesterday, we had a very similar approach to it, right? We had a style tag that we would add within the body tag, right? And then we would type out all our, CSS styles there along with the properties and so on and so forth. We do the same thing with JavaScript, actually, right? Within the body tag, we create something called as a script tag. And that is where we write out all the code that we want to write out, okay? So as you can see here, we have the HTML tag at the root, right? Within that, we have a head tag, then we have a body tag. And within this body tag, we have this script tag, okay? So you would open a script tag with a left angle bracket, write the name of the tag, which is script, close it with the right angle bracket, then write your JavaScript code in between. And then you close the script tag by opening the left angle bracket, putting the /, putting the name of the tag, which in this case is script, and then you close it to the right angle bracket. Okay. So that's how we write JavaScript code. Right. We will take a look at a little bit more, a few examples of what we can do with things like this, in the practical session. But just keep this in mind. Just keep how we write JavaScript in mind for now. Okay, right. So we have seen HTML and CSS so far, right? In HTML, we would write the code into an HTML file. And what would happen was we would open that file in a browser, right? And it would display what we wanted to see, right? It would display what the what the output of that particular program or that particular HTML document was. And the CSS part was just similar, right? We put the CSS code into the file, right, into the HTML file, and then when we loaded the HTML file, it would go through those CSS properties, and then it would set them accordingly, and then it would load the HTML file, right? So JavaScript is also very similar to a certain extent, right? So JavaScript, what it does is you can choose to output the you can choose to output JavaScript code in a few places, right? The most common place would be to output it directly to the HTML document, like we saw previously, right? How we change the color of the text and how we hit that particular element, and then how we changed the content of the tag, right? So that is probably the most common way to output JavaScript code, output the result of a JavaScript code. Then there is one other method that we can use called alert boxes, which will have an alert box that comes on your screen, and this will show the output of the code. But this is not that often used, and I think most modern browsers, even though they have support for it, they're not especially when you're viewing it on a mobile device, it's not the most friendliest of ways to display the output of that code, right? The other method that is also very popularly used is to display it to the console, right? Now, the console is a special feature of any modern web browser that will allow you to, show the output of, JavaScript program, right? So you write a JavaScript program. Then, when you execute it, when you load up when you load up the HTML page, you can output that code to the console, right? Now, the console is not used. It's not used by the end user, right? It's not used by people that are going to be visiting the website and that are going to be using it. It's actually used by the developers, right? It's actually used by people like you and me that build the website. And the reason why we use it is because we want to debug the code, right? We want to know what has happened, how it has happened, and what will happen if we do X, Y, and Z. And the console is a very perfect place to check out what happens, right? So one use for console or to outputting it to the console is for debugging, and the other is for learning. Like, for example, when you're learning JavaScript, the most obvious place that you would output that code to would be the console, because you can then not worry about the HTML part of it, and rather just use it to change, or use it to learn the JavaScript language. All right. We've seen what we can do with JavaScript, some of the examples at least, and where we can output JavaScript code to, right? But how do we write this JavaScript code, right? So the next few slides will actually cover the syntax of JavaScript and how we can use, how we can write JavaScript to achieve certain things. I'd just like to take a moment out and point out here that JavaScript is a little bit more harder than HTML and CSS, but it's not that complicated that you should not be able to get the hang of it, right? JavaScript is a proper programming language, unlike HTML and CSS. So much so that JavaScript today is being used outside the browser, right? It's being used in a language called Node.js, which is a very popular method for building websites today, right? So let's look at the syntax, right? In programming languages, right? In programming languages like C, C++, Python, JavaScript, so on and so forth, there is something called as a variable, right? Now, variables are used to store data values, right? In HTML, probably we can say that a tag is a variable, and that tags, the value of that tag stores the data, right? It's not a one-to-one association. We cannot rightly compare it with that, but that should give you an idea of what a variable is, right? So in JavaScript, we use the var keyword or a var keyword to declare variables, right? So for example, this statement would create a variable called x. So var is the name of the keyword, followed by x, which is the name of the variable, followed by a semicolon, which lets the browser know that it has ended that JavaScript statement over there. We've seen that we have seen the semicolon in CSS as well. It's the same. We use it for the same reason here as well. Okay. Now, variables by definition mean that they vary, right? That is why it has got the name variable. Let's imagine, for example, that you have fishes. You have a variable called fishes, right? Now you have different kinds of fish. You have goldfish, you have fighter fish, you have angelfish, so on and so forth, right? And you have so many different types of fishes. Okay, and if someone is asking you what your favorite fish is, you'll have to enter some value for that, right? And that is the reason why we have a variable, right? Whatever you enter is stored into that variable, so that when you're serving the HTML file to a particular user, it can use that variable, right, and see how it what you have entered, and then put that, substitute the value for that variable in place of the HTML code over there, right? So how do we assign values to these variables? How do we store data into the variables? We use an equal sign for that, right? So this is how we would define a variable. I'm going back to this, right? We create a variable by using the keyword var, putting a space in between, and by naming the variable, right? And then ending it with a semicolon. And we assign value to that variable x by typing out x is equal to 5, okay? And then ending it with a semicolon. Now, that variable called x has a value of 5. It stores a number 5, right? So that's what x contains. So if you should output the variable x, it would contain it would output 5. Okay. Now, I've given you a very simple example of variables and what the kind of variables that we can have in JavaScript, but it gets a little bit more complex, right? JavaScript can have two kinds of values over here, right? We have variables, and we have literals. So we have already seen what variables are, right? Variables are x. We created one variable here previously, and we assigned it the value of 5, right? So that's an example of a variable. It contains information that it contains data that varies, from one document to another. Okay. Now there is something else called as literals as well, and literal, by its name, is literally what it is, right? So if you type in 10, if the value for a literal is 10, then it is 10, right? If you put JavaScript within a double quote, then the value for that literal is JavaScript, right? Or if you put in a string called hello world within single quotes, then the value for that literal would be hello world. So these are the ways that you can define literals in. And if you look at the example from above here, right, where we assigned a value to the variable x is the variable, and 5 is the literal, right? So those are the two kinds of values that we can have in JavaScript. Now let's move on to a topic called as operators, right? What exactly are operators? We have, for example, we have something called as an arithmetic operator, right, in JavaScript. It would have something on the lines of this, right? So it has a bracket, okay? It has a number 5. It has a plus symbol. It has the value 6, the number 6. It has, a closing bracket, and it has a star sign, which is actually called multiplication, right? And then it has 10, right? So the output for this would actually be 110, right? Because if you follow the rules of BODMAS, you would simplify this first within the bracket. That would become 11, right? Then you multiply 11 with 10, which would become 110. So with JavaScript, you can actually do calculations like this, which you cannot do in CSS or in HTML, right? So JavaScript follows very much the same principles that we are used to from our initial days of learning mathematics in school. It still uses things, it still uses concepts like the rule of BODMAS and other things like that to determine what would be executed first. Okay, so in this example, it would simplify whatever is there within the bracket, and then it would multiply this with 10. So you can do operations like this in arithmetic, right? So we have a few operators in JavaScript, which I will go through later in the session. But you have seen plus over here, and you have seen multiplication, which is represented by star. We also have division, which you can do with the slash, the forward slash symbol. You have subtraction, which you can do with the minus or the hyphen symbol, right? And you also have modulus, right? Or reminder, right? You can do that with the percentage symbol. Okay, so for example, you would do 4/4 modulus 2 would be 0, because the reminder for that would be 0, because it is exactly divisible by 2, right? So yeah, we've seen arithmetic operators. The one other operator that we have in JavaScript is called as an assignment operator, right? So what is an assignment operator? We have already seen what an assignment operator is previously, actually. So when we declared a variable called x, right, we put an equal to symbol to it, right, and we give it the value of 5. So this equal to symbol is called as the assignment operator. So whenever we want to assign a variable some value, we use the assignment operator. Okay, and this is used throughout JavaScript for different purposes. And I'll point this out to you when we're doing the practical session as well. Okay, great. Now let's explore the var data type, right? The var keyword. We have seen, we have seen examples of this previously, where we declared, a variable called x, a variable called x over here, and then we assigned it a value of 5, right? So what can we do with that? Let's just see that, right? So let's come back to the slide here, right? We saw that we can assign numbers, or that can hold numbers, right? X, we have defined a variable called x here, and then we are assigning a number 5 to this variable x. So this variable x now holds the number 5, right? So it can hold numbers, right? Now we're creating another variable called x over here, right? And we're assigning this a string or text, right? So we're assigning this hello world. So if I didn't put it within the brackets or within the double quotes, it would not, JavaScript would get confused. It would not know that it was actually a text or it was string. It will only consider something as a text or a string if it is within single quotes or within double quotes, right? So it can hold string or text, right? It can hold booleans, right? Now in the programming world, a boolean is a true or false value, right? For example, if if this color is equal to blue, right? If the color is blue, then it would it would return the value true. That would be a true boolean value, right? If it is not blue in color, then it would be false. So that's an example of what booleans are. Okay. So we've seen that it can hold 3 types of different things. Now, if you're familiar with other types of programming languages like C, C++, or Python, you might have noticed something interesting here, right? In languages like C, C++, you have when you declare a variable, you actually have to put in the data type. So if you're going to hold an integer value, we would say int x, right? And then we would assign it a value of 5. You would assign it an integer value. If you're defining a floating point number, we would say float x, and then we would define it a floating point value, right? Or if we were to define a Boolean variable, we would do bool x, right? And then we would assign x either a true or a false value. But in JavaScript, that is not the case. So this is one of the unique features of JavaScript, right? It's very modular. You can use JavaScript for a variety of purposes, like I've pointed out before. And this is the one thing that makes it so dynamic, right? We don't have explicitly typed variables, right? We don't have an explicit data type that is set. So we can assign it anything that we want. It can be an object, It can be, a boolean, it can be a string, it can be, a numerical value, it can be a floating point value, it can be anything that we want, right? And that is the beauty of JavaScript. Okay, so let's move on to something called as functions. If you're familiar with programming languages, then you would have come across functions at one point of time or the other. Functions are a way for you to execute, a certain block of code, right? So a JavaScript function is a block of code that is designed to perform a particular task. Now, let's imagine that we want to add two numbers, right? We want to add 1 and 2. Uh, Now, if we want to add 1 and 2, we would do it very simply, like 1 plus 2, and JavaScript would calculate that to 3, and it would give you the result for that, right? But the thing is, if let's imagine that you're doing this, very often, right? You're going to add 1 plus 2 very often. You don't want to waste computing resources by doing that operation every single time, when you can just, do it once, store it somewhere, and then retrieve it when it's needed, right? That would make your program much more faster. And the function, a function is the perfect way to do that, right? And if it's also not going to help you out a lot if you're going to keep typing this, this particular bit of code over and over again. That is 1 plus 2, 1 plus 2. If you're going to keep typing it over and over again, let's imagine that you have to add that 10 different times in the code, right? You'd have to type that out 10 different times. But if you write a JavaScript function, that adds 1 and 2 and then returns the value for that, then you wouldn't need to do that. Okay, so a JavaScript function is executed only when something invokes it or when something calls it, right? So unless and until, a JavaScript, so you would define a JavaScript function when you're writing the HTML document, right? But then the browser would do nothing until something is invoking it, right? So you've already seen an example of this when I showed you a little bit earlier, how we can, change certain values, right? So let me just go back to the slide over there, right? For example, I changed the HTML element over here that said, that now says hello JavaScript. Now I had already written this piece of JavaScript code out before I loaded the page, right? I'd already written this, much previous in time. Let me just reload it and I'll show you what I mean, right? So I'm going to reload this page, and now we see that, over here, it's back to its original, it's back to its original text. Now, only when I click on this button is it going to change it. But, I've already written this code out before. It's stored in a function, right? And when I click on that button, I'm invoking that function. So when I invoke that function, it's going to run that particular piece of code and then execute that, right? So let me demonstrate that for you now. I'm going to click the button, and there we see it has changed, right? So a function, it's important to note that a function will only change when you are going to invoke it or when something is going to call it, right? So how do you write a function? Writing a function is very simple, right? You have a keyword called function, right? You type out the keyword called function, put a space after it, then you put in the name of the function. And here's something important, right? You put in 2 parentheses, right? You put in the bracket, the normal bracket that we type, when we write. So you put in that, you open it and you close it. You don't put anything between that, right? And then you open the flower brackets, and then you write the code that needs to be executed within the flower brackets. Now, why do we need this parentheses or this bracket, the round bracket in between, right? Now, JavaScript would not know that something is a function unless and until you put in that. If you don't put it in, then this piece of whatever function you write over here will be pretty much useless because JavaScript cannot decide what it is. Okay, so let's so let's see, right, how we can invoke functions. Now, you've already seen an example of this a few minutes ago as well. I clicked on a button, right, and the function was called, or the function was invoked, right? So that would be an example of when an event occurs, right? The event is the user clicking the button, and when the user clicks the button, that is when the code executes, right? Now, it can also be called from within JavaScript code, right? You can put in the name of the function and then you can call that particular function, right? So this can be done programmatically as well. So let's imagine that you have, you're writing an automation script, right? Where you go to YouTube, you type in, name of the song that you want, and then you click on search. So you can automate that using JavaScript, right? And if you would want to do that, then you would have to call functions to do each of those things, programmatically or within the JavaScript code. So that's another way to call the function, right? And the other way to invoke functions or to call functions is automatically, right? So, for example, you write a function out, right? And then within that function, you do something, and then you call that function from within the function. This is called a recursive function, right? And this is a little bit more of an advanced topic that is very complex. It can get very complex very easily, but it's good to know that is another way that we can call JavaScript functions from, right? Now, I mentioned before that when we have JavaScript functions that perform a certain variable, that they return a value, right? I'll probably try to relate this to something real world, right? Now, you are sitting in front of a computer, right? And you're going to type, you're going to type out a post that you want to put on Facebook, but probably a recipe that you just tried at home today, right? But you don't know the names of certain names of certain ingredients. You don't know names for them in English, right? And most of the people that read your posts know English. So what you do is you call a friend, right? Or you call your mother, whoever knows what it is that you're dealing with, right? And then you ask them what the name for XYZ ingredient is in English, and then you type it out. So a function is very similar, right? When you call that person, you are calling the function, right? That function is going to process the information. It's going to execute some things, and then it's going to return the name in English, right? So that's what a function does. When you type out a function, you expect it to return some information, or you expect it to return some data. Now, you can also write functions without actually returning anything. It's not hard and fast bound rule that you need to, every function needs to return something. But it is good to know, it's good to receive an acknowledgement when you're learning JavaScript, especially that, a function has finished execution and that it has returned the value, right? Now, when JavaScript, comes over the return statement, it is going to stop the execution of that JavaScript code and then go back to wherever the original piece of code was, right? So here is an example, right? I'm taking the same example of adding two numbers, right? So we create a function, okay? We call the name of the function add. We put in the two round parentheses next to it. We open the we open the flower brackets, and then within that we write return, which is the keyword, and then we say 2 plus 3. So 2 plus 3 is going to, it's going to determine what 2 plus 3 first is, which will be 5. And then when you call the function add, it's going to return the value of 5. So when we call this function, add from somewhere, it's now going to give you a value of 5. Great. So why functions? I've kind of gone over this a little bit earlier as well, but it's good to repeat. It's good to repeat things so that you learn it a little bit better. Now, what exactly is why exactly do we use functions? Functions help you to reduce the amount of code that you write. Let's say, for example, that you're writing a function that adds two numbers, right? You don't want to have to write this function out each time that you want to add those two numbers, right? Instead, you can just write it out once and then call it the next time when you need to add those two numbers, right? And this is the reason why functions are used a lot, and it's not just used in JavaScript alone. It's used in other programming languages like Python. It's used in C, C++, Java, and so on and so forth, right? One other thing that we have not covered here, because it's a little bit more of a complex topic, is getting different results by passing in different parameters, right? I'll probably show you that in the practical session when we go on later, when we get to the practical session later. But it's a little bit more of a complicated topic, and we're not going to be using that as much in this workshop, right? Okay. Now we get to the next part of JavaScript, right? We get to the point where we get to have some fun with it, right? So we're going to look at something called as conditional statements. Now, if you're used to any programming language, right, one of the most common things that we do is we check if a certain thing is true or a certain thing is what it claims to be, right? This is, this is the core, one of the core reasons why a programming language is a programming language. If you can get to do some things that you normally cannot, that is normally very hard for us to do, you would write a program for that. And conditional statements are at the heart of that, right? So what is a conditional statement? It's very simple, right? Conditional statements are used to perform different actions based on different conditions, right? For example, we use two conditional statements called if and else. So we execute a certain bit of code if something is true. Okay, let's take an example. Let's imagine that we are checking if a color is blue, right? Now, if that color is blue, okay, we are then going to execute certain code. But if it is not blue, we execute a different bit of code. Or keeping it in line with what we discussed before. If you have a website that is greeting different people, right? Or if you have a website that has a paid plan and a free plan, right? You would use conditional statements to check if the user is on a paid plan or if the user is on a free plan, right? If the user is on a paid plan, we display information that comes along with that. Or if he's on a free plan, we don't display it, right? So that's how you would go about doing it. So how do we write if conditions? How do we write if statements? It's very similar to the other things that we have seen, right? So initially we write the keyword called if, okay, followed by the condition, which goes within parentheses, right? And then we open the flower bracket, and then we write the code to be executed within the flower brackets. Okay, so for example, let's check that the variable x holds the value of 1, right? That is what the first example does. So we check if x is equal to 1. And the reason why we use double equals over here is so that, you might remember from a few slides previously that a single equal to will assign the value. So if I put in a single equal to sign here, x will now have the value of 1, and we don't want to do that. Let's imagine that we have set the variable x someplace else by doing a series of complicated calculations, right? Now we don't want to lose that calculation and redo it all over again by accidentally setting it, resetting the value of x over here, right? So in order to get over that confusion, the creator of JavaScript decided that double equal to would check if it holds that particular value, right? So if x double equal to 1, then we say that we execute whatever code we want to execute. So it's only going to execute the code within this flower bracket. Okay, within this flower bracket, it's only going to execute if this condition returns true, right? So if, for example, if x is equal to 5, right, and if we are checking if x is equal to 1, it's not true. 1 is not equal to 5, right? So since 1 is not equal to 5, it's not going to execute the condition. It's not going to execute the code within the flower brackets, right? Now, if you want to check if x holds the text hello, right, we would do it like this. So if x is equal to within quotes hello, if it's something different, then that's going to return false, and the code within the parentheses or within the flower bracket is not going to execute, right? And if you want to check if something is true or false, you would just do x is equal to true. Okay, great. So putting all of that together, this is what we get, right? So we check if sum is less than 10, we do x is equal to 2 plus 1. So sum is a variable, right? I'll just break this down. Sum is a variable, and it holds the sum of probably two numbers or something like that, right? Now, if that is lesser than 10, right? For example, let's consider that sum holds a value of 5. Now, 5 is less than 10, right? So it's going to execute x is equal to 2 plus 1. So now it's going to add 2 plus 1, which will be 3, and it's going to assign that value to x. Okay, so the value of x is now 3. Okay, so if sum is less than 10, okay, it's going to execute this. Now, if the sum was 11, for example, 11 is greater than 10, right? So it's not going to execute this at all. Okay, it's not going to add 2 plus 1, and it's not going to assign it to x. It's just going to move on to the next line of code, right? Now we've spoken about if statements, right? And I said, else statements are used to execute certain things if it is false. Now in the previous example, we saw that if the sum was 11, right, it would not do this, right? Now, if we add an else statement, right, this is what it would look like. So if sum is less than 10, then it's going to add 2 plus 1 and assign that value to x, right? Otherwise, it's just going to set the value of x to 0. So if sum was 11 in this case, right, 11 is greater than 10, it's not lesser than 10, right? So that would be, it's not going to execute the statement. Rather, it will just come directly to this else and execute x is equal to 0, right? Okay, great. Now we're going to look at something called as for loops, right? So we are seeing functions, right? And I've told you that functions execute certain bits of code without you having to type them over and over again, right? Now, for loops can do the same thing, right? But it repeats that, n number of times. So it can execute a block of code n number of times, right? For example, we can print, the text "Hello World" 5 times, or we can count from 1 to 10, using a for loop, or we can print all the even numbers from 1 to 10, right? So that's kind of what we can do with JavaScript, right? With JavaScript. So if you use all these basic concepts, if you use for loops, if you use if conditions, if you use, the different data types, if you can use all the methods to manipulate HTML and CSS, then we would have a very robust programming language that can be used to, make certain calculations, and based on that, change certain values within an HTML document, for example, right? So that's the beauty of JavaScript. Okay, let's take a look at how we can define a for loop, right? So it starts off with the for keyword, right? We say for, and then we have the parentheses, right? We have the round brackets, and within that we have some things. We have 3 statements: statement 1, statement 2, and statement 3. Now, all of these are separated by semicolons in between, right? And then we open the flower bracket, and then we write the code that needs to be executed. So let's break this down, right? Let's see what statement 1 does. Now, statement 1 is executed one time before the execution of this entire code block, right? So the browser is going to come across this for loop, right? The browser will come across this for loop. It says statement 1. It is going to execute that statement just once, right? And it's never going to touch that until the for loop is done. Okay. Then it goes on to the second statement. Okay. Now the second statement defines the condition for executing that particular code block, right? So this would be very similar to the condition that we use for if conditions, right? So we would check for something like if it is below a certain value, right? You would execute whatever code needs to be executed within, right? And then the third statement would be executed after the code block has been completed, right? Every time that the code block completes executing, it would execute statement 3, right? So I'll go over this again. We start out writing a for loop by using the keyword for. We would open round brackets. We would write in 3 statements and separate it out by semicolons. Statement 1 is going to be executed once before the execution of the for loop. Statement 2 would be executed, every single time the for loop starts, right? And statement 3 will be executed at the end of, the for loop. Okay, so let's take an example, right? So we have a for loop over here, and this is a very basic for loop that is used in most programming languages, right? The syntax is the same for pretty much any programming language. And if you are already used to a programming language like C or C++ or Java or Python, you would be familiar with the syntax, right? So for, we have a variable called I, which has a value, which we are setting a value of 0 over here. So I is now 0, okay? So the for loop will start, okay? It'll set I is equal to 0, right? Then it'll check if I is less than 5. So now 0 is less than 5, right? So 0 is true. So that condition is true. Then it's going to execute this statement, okay, which is console.log of hello world, which is basically it's going to print hello world into the console, right? Now, once it's done, right, it's going to come back to this I++, right? Now, I++ is a shorthand for writing, by incrementing I. So if I is 0, I++ will be 1, okay? So I++, it's going to execute that. Now the value of I is 1, right? Now it's going to come back to this statement, okay? Now 1 is less than 5, right? So it's going to go and it's going to execute console.log of hello world, right? Which will print another hello world statement within the console. Then it's going to increment the value of I, okay? Now at this point, I is 2, right? Now it's going to come back and check if 2 is less than 5 and 2 is less than 5. So it's again going to execute console.log of hello world, which will print hello world for the third time within the console, right? Then it's going to increment the value of I by 1. So now it is 3, okay? So it checks, is 3 less than 5? Yes, 3 is less than 5. So it's going to execute console.log of hello world, right? So it's going to print hello world for the fourth consecutive time. Okay, now it's going to increment the value of I by 1. And now it will be 4, right? The value of I is 4. It's going to come back, is 4 less than 5? Yes, 4 is less than 5. So it's going to execute console.log of hello world for the 5th time. It's going to print it to the console for the 5th time. After this, it's going to increment I by 1 more time. Now I is equal to 5, right? It's going to come back over here. It checks, is 5 less than 5? No, 5 is not less than 5. 5 is equal to 5, right? 5 is not less, it cannot be less than 5. So the condition returns false, and then the for loop ends. So you now have, a for loop that will print hello world to the console 5 different times. So this is one of the examples that you can do with for loops, right? And when we're going over the practical session, I will cover how we can write for loops that can do certain things, right? Great. Now we have seen whatever I've told you so far is some of the basics of JavaScript, not just of JavaScript but of any programming language. If you're going to learn C++, if you're going to learn something like Java, if you're going to learn something like Python, or something along those lines, whatever we have discussed today is still going to hold true, right? You're going to learn what variables are. You're going to learn if conditions, you're going to learn else conditions, you're going to learn if else conditions, you're going to learn for loops, you're going to learn statements, you're going to learn booleans, you're going to learn strings, you're going to learn texts, you're going to learn literals, you're going to learn all of this, right? But we've still not gotten into the meat of JavaScript, right? While we can do all of this, how exactly can we interface it, or how exactly can we use JavaScript with HTML elements, right? For example, I think I've shown you this a couple of times already, and let me just show it to you again, right? We have certain things here, right? What can JavaScript do? So, for example, it can change the content of that HTML, right? It can change the color. So, if I'm going to click on this button, it's going to change the color of that HTML element, right? And then it can hide HTML elements, right? So all of that is great, right? It's we can do lots of things, but how exactly are we going to use that within how are we going to use a JavaScript to manipulate those HTML elements? That's what we're interested in this workshop, right? That's what we're interested in, how we are going to learn how to do that and what we can do with things like that, right? And before we forget, we're building a website for a cafe, right? And we will use these concepts to add a little bit of interactivity into that website. We're going to use all the concepts that we've learned today, and then we're going to take that and we're going to translate it across into a real world example. Okay, great. So uh, over the last couple of days, I have spoken to you about certain things. In HTML, I spoke to you about attributes, right? We had a class attribute and we had an ID attribute. And I told you that these class attributes and these ID attributes can be used to kind of, refer to those HTML elements outside of HTML, right? Yesterday we saw them. We saw how we can use those class and ID attributes within CSS. And today we're going to see how we can use it within JavaScript. Okay, so if you want to target a HTML element that has an ID of ID, right? This is how we would do it. We would start out by writing document, which tells the browser that, hey, we have this HTML document. Now I want you to go to this document, right? After you go to that document, I want you to get an element by ID, right? So get element by ID is one of the properties that JavaScript has, right? It's one of the methods that JavaScript offers. So it asks the browser to go and get that element by ID, right? And then it's going to say that I want the ID name to be equal to ID, right? Okay, so it says that, hey, I want you to go to that document. Okay, I want you to look up for a HTML element that has an attribute of ID with the value of ID, right? So that is how you use a selector. This is basically called a selector, right? This is what we learned in CSS yesterday. So that is how we select elements in JavaScript. That's how we select HTML elements in JavaScript. So we have seen how we can use it to get an ID, right? Let's see how we can use it to get to target class names, right? We have an attribute called class in HTML, and that can hold multiple different values, right? So in order to get a class that has a value of class, you would type out document dot get elements by class name. You must notice that there is a difference here. In the previous statement, we said get element by ID, right? But here we're saying get elements by class name. The difference, the reason why we're using a plural here is because classes can be multiple, right? You can have multiple classes, but you can have only a single ID, right? So we would let the browser know, hey, I want you to go to this document and get all the elements which has a class name of class, right? That is what we tell the browser. That is what the statement tells the browser to do. Great. Okay. Now we can combine this, right? We can combine this to achieve certain things. Remember that example where I changed the color of the text? This is how I did it, right? I assigned it an ID of red. Okay, so I said document dot get element by ID of red, right? Dot style dot property, and then I assigned it a value of value, right? So this is how I did it. This is how I did that, right? So let's break this down, right? This piece of JavaScript code is telling the browser, hey, I want you to go to the document. I want you to look for an element which has an ID of red, right? Then I want you to go into its style property, right? And then I want you to change one of the style properties to value, right? So this property needs to be replaced with the property that we want to change. So if you would want to change the background, for example, we would say background over there, and we would assign it a value of red or green or whatever, right? And if you wanted to change the text color, then we would do color, right? So you would say dot style dot color is equal to red. Okay, so let's take a look at that same example again and change the color of the text, right? So document dot get element by ID of red, okay, dot style dot color is equal to red. Okay, so I'll just go over that one single time. document dot get element by ID of red, dot style dot color is equal to red. Great. Now we have come to that part of the session where that part of the workshop where we go on with the practical session. Now this practical session is going to be a little bit different from the previous ones, primarily because I'll be showing you some of the basics of JavaScript, and in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to last 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to go back to the website that we created the previous day and do certain things, right? I'm going to make, like when we click on the submit button of that form, I'm going to hide the form and I'm going to display a message that says, thank you for getting in touch, right? So stay tuned for that. But right now, what we're going to do is go over some of the basics of JavaScript, right? So I'm going to go to codepen.io like I've done for the past 2 days so that we can easily see what we are working with, right? I'm going to create a new pen, okay? And if you're following along at home, you can do the same thing along with me, right? Now, for the first part of this practical session, we actually are not going to be using the HTML or the CSS part of it. In fact, we're going to be working with just the JavaScript part of it. And we are going to output every single thing that we do to the console, okay? So at the bottom left of the screen, right? At the bottom left of the screen, you have a button over here that says console. Just click on that and you'll get this. And you can drag it out so that we can, see what we are working with over here, okay? So let's start off, right? Now, one of the first things that we learned in JavaScript was variable, right? So let's go ahead and declare a variable, right? So I'm going to type out var, which is how you declare a variable. And I'm going to name this x, right? So let's just back up there, right? I have typed out var. And now you can see here on the right-hand side that it says there is a syntax error, right? It says missing variable name, right? The reason it says that is because JavaScript is unlike HTML and CSS, it's not very forgiving of errors, right? If there is even a single error in your JavaScript code, that entire website is not going to work. It's not going to execute, right? It's not going to have the result, expected results. Okay, so if while we are typing this out over here, if you see any such errors, ignore it for the moment until I say that we are done typing, right? So I'm going to clear this. I'm going to say variable x, okay, and then I'm going to put a semicolon next to that. Now you don't actually see anything on the right hand side, and that's because we have not done anything with it, right? So we have now declared a variable called x. Okay, it does not hold any value. In fact, let's print out what x contains, right? So I'm going to do console.log. Okay, and console is going to target the console on the right hand side, and .log will tell that I want you to log whatever I'm putting within the parentheses over there. So I'm going to say log of x. Okay, and if you wait for it, we see nothing because it does not hold anything. It says undefined, right? And it's undefined because we have not defined a value for x. So let's change that, right? So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to say x is equal to 5. And I'm going to put a semicolon and wait for it to load. Now you can see over here, right, that it says x is equal to 5, right? So it says 5. So now we know that the value of x contains 5. Now let's change this, right? Let's change it from 5 to 10, right? And we wait for it to load. And then we see that now it has changed the value of x to 10, right? Great. So we're getting somewhere with JavaScript, okay? Now, let's do simple arithmetic operations, right? Just to kind of see what we're working with, right? So I'm going to, I'm going to delete this entire thing, and I'm just going to work with the console.log, right? I'm going to clear this, and within this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to clear that, okay? I'm going to type out 5 plus 5. So this should output 10 on the right-hand side, right? And it does. Now this is addition. So if we change it from 5, if we change the last 5 to 3, this should output 8, right? 5 plus 3 is 8, and it does on the right-hand side. It says 8. Great, right? Now we know addition works, right? Let's try subtraction. 5 minus 3 is equal to 2, and on the right-hand side, you can see that it is 2. Great. Okay. Now I'm going to change the value, right? I'm going to say 1 minus 3. And now, if you know maths, I mean, this should not be, if it's humans that is calculating, this computation, you would say 1 minus 3. Oh, that would be 3 minus 1, which is 2, right? And we would say, we would ignore the negative part of it, right? Most of the times. But this is an example of where computers like to be really, really specific. So unless you, give it very specific instructions, it is going to take it very literally, right? So I did 1 minus 3, where 1 is lesser than 3, right? So it's going to give a negative value, right? Because that's how, that's how algebra works from, from 6th, 7th, 8th standards, right? That's what we learned in 6th, 7th, 8th standard, right? So it says minus 2 on the right hand side, and that is correct. But what if I were to change it to 3 minus 1, right? I'm going to change it to 3 minus 1, and then we see on the right hand side that it now says 2. Okay, great. Now we have done subtraction, right? Let's now do. We have done addition. We have done subtraction. Let's now do multiplication. So 2 star 2. Star is, remember that star is how we say we want to multiply things, right? So 2 times 2 is 4, and we see that it outputs 4 on the right hand side, which is correct, right? If I change this to 2 times 4, it should output 8. And if you wait for it to load, we see that it does indeed output 8. Great. Okay. Now, let's see what happens when we divide things, right? So when you're working with division, I'd just like to remind you that we have things called rational numbers, and we have, things like that. So whenever we divide 4 by 2, right, we get a whole number, we get 2, right? But when we divide 2 by 4, we don't get a whole number, we get 1 by 2, which is a rational number, right? So let's see what happens. I'm going to replace this asterisk with a forward slash, which is how JavaScript knows that it needs to divide those two numbers. And you can see on the right hand side that it actually outputs 0.5. Now 0.5 is equal to 1 by 2, right? So we know that that is right. Let's change this to 4 by 2 and see what happens, right? So I do 4 by 2, wait for it to load, and then, we get 2. So, it works as expected. Great. Now, there's one other arithmetic operation that I would like you to see, right? And this is called as a modulo operator, right? Now, what the modulo does is it's going to output 0 if it has a reminder of 0, right? Or it's going to output whatever value of the modulo is, of the reminder is, if not, right? So when I divide 4 by 2, we are going to get a reminder of 0, right? Because 4 is exactly divisible by 2. And you can see on the right hand side that it doesn't put 0. But if I divide, if I divide 3 by 2, I am not going to get a whole number. I'm not going to get 0 as a reminder. I'm going to get some sort of reminder. And, we can see that when I change the 4 to 3, so I get a reminder of 1, which is what, we get when we do, when we divide 3 by 2. Great. Now, just to keep in, demonstrate that this follows, the rules of BODMAS, I'd like to open a bracket, say 10 plus 5, okay? 10 plus 5 divided by, I'm just going to clear this, right? Real quick, clear it, right? So 10 plus 5 divided by 3, right? Which is 5, because 10 plus 5 is 15, right? So it's going to replace this value with 15, right? And then it's going to divide 15 by 3. So 3 times 5 is 15. So the answer for that is 5, which is correct, right? If I don't put in the brackets, you will see what happens right over here. Okay, I'm going to do 10. Okay, just wait for it. Okay, I'm going to clear it. I'm going to do it again, just so that we work on a clean slate here. Okay, I'm waiting for it to load the answer on the right hand side. Okay, just give me a moment. So 10 plus 5 divided by 3, right? So if you see the second value that it prints out is 11.66666, right? The reason is it's first going to add 10 plus 5, right? And then what it's going to do is it's not going to divide 5 divided by 3, because if you remember the rules of BODMAS, right? What does it state? That division happens first, right? Addition, subtraction, division and multiplication happens first. Addition, subtraction happens towards the end. So first it's going to divide 5 by 3, and then it's going to add 10 to that, which is, so you get 1.6666 is when you divide 5 by 3, and to that it's going to add 10. So you see here, in fact, that it does follow the rules of BODMAS. Okay, so whenever whenever you're doing some sort of arithmetic operation, keep this in mind, right? Especially when your value depends on, especially when you when that value that you're computing is very critical to the application that you're building, right? Okay, great. So we've seen what we've seen what how console.log works. Console.log is going to print it to the console, which makes it very easy for us to learn JavaScript, or for us to debug certain things when we are writing very complex JavaScript applications. Okay, great. Now let's go back, right? Let's create a variable again, right? And I'm going to leave this as it is, right? And I'm going to come back later. So I'm going to create a variable called x, right? I'm going to assign a value. I'm going to create another variable called y. And remember, guys, I haven't mentioned this so far, but when you're creating variables, you can name it anything that you want, right? So just to make things a little bit more complicated, I'm going to name a variable called number. Okay, I'm going to create a variable called number, right? And I'm going to create a variable called uh, not number. Okay, just to keep things interesting, right? And now we have a variable called number, and we have another variable called not number, right? I'm just going to clear this out real quick, right? And then I'm going to drop to a new line. We have a variable called number. We have a variable called not number. What I'm going to do is now I'm going to assign a number of 5. Okay, so number now holds the value 5, and not number, okay, will hold a value of 7. Okay, now this is something that is really interesting that you can do with JavaScript. You can actually add those two variables, right? So number plus not number, okay, is now going to give you an output of 12, right? Let me just clear that very quickly for you. I'm going to, I'm going to wait for that to load up again. Okay, plus node number, and we can see on the right hand side that it now shows 12, right? Console.log should print 12. Oh, come on. Let's just wait for it to load, right? And we see that it does indeed print 12 on the right hand side. So 5 plus 7 is equal to 12. 5 is what is held in number. Sorry, 5 is what is held in number. 7 is what is held in not number. I'm adding number and not number, and I'm getting 12, right? Great. Now, remember that we spoke about variables. We said that variables can hold anything and everything, right? So I'm just going to delete this real quick, right? I'm going to delete this entire thing. And I'm now going to create a new variable called, I'm going to create a new variable called text, right? So this is a variable called text. And I'm going to assign to text hello world, and I'm going to close it, right? Great. I'm going to clear this now, and I'm going to output the value of text on the console. And as we wait for it to load, we see that it now says hello world on the right hand side, right? Amazing. So we know that that works. Now, I'm going to very quickly create a variable called text2, right? And to text2, I am going to assign, a variable called hi. Okay, great. Now what I'm going to do is in console, I'm going to use the plus plus operator, and then I'm going to type out text2, right? And as we wait for it to load, we can see below. Let's just clear it again. Um, Give me a moment. I'm going to do that, right? Wait for it to load again. I'm going to paste it, and then we see that it says hello world and hi at the end, right? There's no space, but you can see that it also adds up strings. Amazing, right? Okay, so let's quickly delete this, right? And then move to booleans, right? So is it a color? Okay, I'm going to create a variable called is it a color, and I'm going to assign is it a color as true. Okay, and it's just going to quickly clear this, wait for it to load, right? And now I'm going to output the value of is it a color, right? And now on the right hand side it should say true, right? So if I change this to false and wait for it to load, it should now say false. So we've seen that it can hold booleans, we've seen that it can hold text, and we've seen that it can hold numbers, right? Great. Okay, now let's move to functions, right? Let's delete this entire thing. Okay, we'll type it out when we need it, right? I'm going to clear the console as well so that we can start out with a clean slate, right? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a variable called, sorry, I'm not going to create a variable. I'm going to create a function, right? Called hello, right? And I'm just going to clear all of this. I'm going to create a function called hello. I'm going to open the flower brackets, and I'm going to leave it as it is, right? Let's just clear this, right? So we have a function called hello, right? And this is going to actually return, okay, a string called hello. As simple as that. But you can see right now that nothing happens. This is nothing working, right? There's nothing that's happening. And the reason for this is because although this function exists, it's not going to execute until we call a function or unless that function is invoked. So let's invoke this function, right? Let's invoke this function by printing it out to the console. So console.log of hello. And as we wait for it to load, we can see on the right hand side that it does indeed say hello, right? Excellent. So we can do much more complicated things with this, right? So for example, we can add you know what is, let's create a variable called x and assign it 1 plus 3, right? So I'm going to put in a semicolon, right? And then I'm going to return hello. I'm going to put a space after that, and I'm just going to add a plus sign, and then I'm going to do x, right? And as we wait for it to load, it now adds 1 plus 2, and then it says hello 4, right? Great. So now we have seen how we can create functions and how we can invoke functions, right? The next thing that we need to do is we need to see how we can work with conditional statements, right? So if you remember our presentation from before, we said that conditional statements work in this manner, right? So we say that we have the keyword called if, right? Then we have we open the parentheses, the round parentheses. Then we add in we write the condition that needs to be computed, and then we write the code that needs to be executed. So going back here, right, we have this function, right? I'm going to delete this entire thing out, right? And I'm going to write if. Okay, I'm going to write if. I'm going to put in the condition that says if 1 is less than 2, I'm going to say console.log, clear this out, and I'm going to say if 1 is less than 2, print 1 is less than 2, right? And as we see on the right hand side, it does indeed say 1 is less than 2, right? Amazing. So, but now what happens if we do 2 is less than 2, right? It's not going to execute that because 2 is less than 2 is not going to execute. So you don't see any output here on the right hand side because it's never going to execute that code. It first checks if this condition is true, right? If that condition is not true, then it's not going to execute this particular statement, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in an else condition here, and I'm going to print console dot log that says, I'm going to clear this out. I'm going to say console dot log 1 is not less than 2. Okay, and as we wait for it to load, we can see on the right hand side that it does in fact say 1 is not less than 2. So it has actually executed the code that is within this else statement, right? So now that covers if and else statements very quickly, right? So we've taken a look at if conditions, we've taken a look at functions, we've taken a look at how to declare variables, how to use variables, how to add variables, how to do arithmetic operations on them, right? Now the next thing that we are actually going to see is called for loops, and this is probably one of the most interesting things that you can learn in JavaScript, right, or in any programming language for that matter. You can just automate a list of things, and then it would do, it would run through that loop and it would do it, right? So let's create. Let's just recap on how to create and a for loop, right? So we start off with the statement for, right, the keyword for. So I'm going to type that out, right? And for now, I'm just going to ignore the console on the right-hand side so that we can concentrate on the code that we are writing, right? I'm going to come back here. So we have 4, right? And then we open it with a bracket. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to open a bracket, right? Works as expected. And then we have statement 1, statement 2, and statement 3. And I'm going to type that out as it is, right? Statement 1, statement 2, okay, 3, right? And then the next thing that we see over here is that we need to open a flower bracket and write in the code that needs to be executed, right? So I'm going to do that. Now, it's actually going to throw an error if you do it this way. And you can see that when we, go to the right-hand side and look at the console, it says, it's printed out a bunch of syntax errors. So let's clear that very quickly, right? And hide it again. So let's replace this with actual statements, right? So let's imagine that we want to print a for loop. We want to create a for loop that prints hello world 5 times, right? Let's do that. So the first statement for that would be to declare a variable called I and set it to 0, var I is equal to 0. Great. Okay. Now the second statement, okay, is going to be executed. So the first statement is going to be executed only the first time that the browser encounters this for loop, right? The second statement is going to be executed every time that the for loop runs, and it's going to check if a certain condition is true. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if I is less than 5, okay? So I'm going to check if I is less than 5, right? And the third statement is going to execute at the end of the for loop, right? Each time the for loop ends when it reaches this bracket, it's going to come back and it's going to increment this particular statement, right? And here I'm going to do I plus 1, okay? So I have a for loop that starts off with 0, that goes all the way up until 4, right? And then it's going to print out console.log of hello. Let's wait for it to load. Okay, great. Now let's go here and see what actually happens, right? Let's open the console and we should now see Okay, let's just wait for it to load, and we should see on the right hand side that it now does in fact display okay. We're still waiting for it to load, by the way. Okay, it's compiling. It should now come. You can see at the bottom here that it does say processing code, right? So we're still waiting on it. We're still waiting for it to go through that for loop. Okay. Let me reload this very, very quickly, right? Let's reload this very quickly. So okay, still waiting for it to load. Okay. Okay, let me just reopen this very quickly, right? I'm going to open codepen.io, right? And hope that it loads up now. So I've opened a new codepen, right? Waiting for it to load up. Let's type it out again, right? There's going to be no harm in doing that. Okay, great. I'm going to put this on top. I'll bring this a little bit here. Right now, I'm going to type in for var I is equal to 0, I is less than 5, I plus 1, right? And I'm going to type in, I'm just going to clear this out. I'm going to type in, okay, console.log, and I'm going to print out right, I'm going to print out hello world, right? So we wait for it to load, right? And then on the right hand side, we now see that it's going to print hello world 5 times. Okay, there does appear to be some issue with CodePen today, right? So let's just try one more time. I'm going to close this tab and open it again. Okay, great. Let's try it one last time, guys. Okay, right. So I'm going to do for var I is equal to 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus, okay, and then I'm going to type out console.log of hello world, okay, and then we wait for it to load, and we see that on the right hand side it does in fact load hello world 5 times, right? Okay, great. Now let's add a slight twist to this, right? We do know that we can use these variables, we can add strings, right? So I'm going to change the last part of this, right? Add a space, and then I'm going to output I. So it now says hello 0, hello 1, hello 2, hello 3, hello 4, right? But let's start with 1, right? So you can see that the variable I starts with 0 over here. If I add 1 to that over here, right, it'll output hello I plus 1, right? Okay, so it should now say hello 1, hello 2, hello 3, hello 4, hello 5. Okay, okay, great. Okay, so that covers for loops, right? Let's do one other for loop. Okay, let's in fact let's clear this out, right? Um, let's clear this out. What we're going to do right now is we're going to check, or we're going to print from 1 to 10. We're going to print all the even numbers, right? So how do we know if a number is even or not? If it's exactly divisible by 2, then it's an even number. And we know how to check for reminders, right? If there is no reminder, then it's, it's exactly divisible, right? So we know how to check for 0 reminder. We do that by using modulo operator, right? So let's change the for loop a little bit here, right? So now instead of starting with 0, it's going to start with 1, and it'll be less than or equal to 10, right? Because we need 10 inclusive. 10 is, from 1 to 10, 10 is also an even number, right? So what we do over here is we're going to say that if, right, if I percentage 2 equal to 0, right? What are we going to do? Let's just clear this out. We're going to do console.log of I. Okay, great. Now, as we wait for it to load, on the right hand side, we can see that it has printed out a list of all of the even numbers from 1 to 10. So that is 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Okay, great. Now, what do we do if we want to check? If we want to print out all the even numbers, right? So it's very simple, right? Now I've shown you how in this if statement how we're saying if it is equal to 0, then we're going to print out everything. But if I can change one of the equal to an exclamation mark, right? So this will make it out to be that it's not equal to 0. So anything that is not equal to 0 is not divisible by 2, and as a result, we will get all the odd numbers, right? So, and if you look at it on the right hand side, we do see that it is printed out all the odd numbers from 1 to 10. We see 1, we see 3, we see 5, we see 7, and we see 9, which is great. Okay, so that's how we can use for loops and how we can use if conditions, right? So let's take this one step further, right? So I'm going to go through 1 through 10, right? I'm going to keep the loop the same, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this entire if condition somewhere else. I'm going to create a function actually, right? So I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call it is even, or okay, is even, or okay, I'm going to create is even, right? I'm going to name the function is even. I'm going to drop to a new line. Okay, I've created a function called is even, and I'm going to pass within this a parameter called I, right? So I'm going to check if this number is even or if it is odd. If it is even, I'm going to say that this number is even, right? So if I percentage 2 is equal to 0, right? I'm going to return, okay. I'm going to return I plus is even, right? Then I'm going to do else, okay. Return I plus is odd, okay. Now I've not done anything so far, right? So on the right hand side, you should not see anything. You should just see a bunch of errors. You should not see anything. We have not called this function yet. So it's going to go through. It's going to go from 1 through 10, and it's going to list out every number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it's going to say that this is even and this is odd, right? So how do we do that? I'm going to call this function, right? The function is called is even, and I'm going to pass it the variable I. which we have defined over here, right? And now if you wait for it to load on the right hand side, we can in fact see that is going to return a function, right? So give me a moment. Okay, all right, waiting for it. And if you wait for it to load on the right hand side, oh, okay. I know why we're not getting anything on the right hand side, right? We need to actually print to the console, right? So instead of doing return, okay, what we can actually do is we can do console.log of is even of I. And if you wait for it to load on the right hand side, okay, it's now going to print 1 is odd, 2 is even, 3 is odd, 4 is even, 5 is odd, 6 is even, 7 is odd, 8 is even, 9 is odd, and 10 is even. Now, great, right? So that's how we can use JavaScript in a very, very basic sense. Now, let's go on to the fun things, right? Let's very quickly clear out, let's remove this console. Let's create a tag. Let's create a p tag which has an ID of, you know, um, let's call this hello, right? And let's say that this is going to have the text hello, right? Now, this I realize that this might be a little bit, so I'm small for you to see, so I'm going to change that to a H1, right? And now you can see that, right? H1, okay, great. Now we have a heading tag, a heading one tag, which has an ID of hello. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the color for that particular text to green, right? So document dot get element by ID of hello dot style, sorry, my bad, dot style dot color is equal to green, right? So if you wait for it to load on the right hand side, we should now see that it has, you know, color of green. Now let's go and make that text a little bit more bigger to read, right? So I would type it out. I would type it out this way: document dot get element by ID of hello dot style dot font size is equal to 60 pixels, right? And if you wait for it to load, we see that it has now become a lot more bigger, right? Okay, great. Now I want to hide this, right? I want to hide this on the right hand side. How do we do that? Very simple, right? So we spoke about a CSS property called display yesterday, right? We set the value of display to either block or to inline block. Well, it has one more property, right? It has one more value that it can be set to, which is called none. If you set it to none, it's going to hide that particular element, right? So we are now going to go and modify it in, modify that particular property and set it to none in order to hide this heading tag, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So document dot get ele element by ID of of hello dot style dot display is equal to none. And as we wait for it to load, we can see that it has now disappeared from the HTML on the right hand side. Right? Amazing. Okay. Great. All right. So we have seen how we can change the color, how we can change the font size, how we can hide that particular element. Now we can also let's do one thing, right? Let's delete this last line of code, and what we'll do is we'll actually underline that particular text, right? So now we can see that it is that. So document dot get element by ID of hello dot style dot text decoration is equal to underline, and as we wait for it to load up, we can see on the right hand side that it now is underlined. Okay, great. So we know how we can work with JavaScript in order to modify CSS attributes and HTML, manipulate HTML elements, right? Let's go back to what we were working with yesterday, right? Let's go back to the website that we built for the small cafe, right? So I'm going to open it up. Just give me a moment. Okay, we'll wait for it to load up, and just going to hide this for a while. I want to show you what we've worked on so far. We have created, a website where at the top we have a navigation menu, right? We have a heading, we have a paragraph tag, we have an image that is being displayed here. Okay, we have one more heading that says our menu. Okay, we have one more paragraph tag that gives it some context. Then we have another image which is on the left hand side, and on the right hand side we have a bunch of um, dishes that is there on the menu, right? And below that we have one more heading that asks for people to leave their feedback, one more paragraph tag, right? Then we have an HTML form over here, and we can type things out over here, and then when we click on submit, well, nothing will happen right now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to modify the behavior of that form, right? So I have just clicked on the submit and nothing happens, right? We can do nothing. So let's take a look at how we've created that form, right? So here it is, right? I've created an element called form. Okay, I've created a tag called form. Okay, I have said that the name for that form is feedback, and I have set an ID for that particular form to feedback form, right? Then let me just bring this. Okay, and then can I drag it out a little bit more? Yeah. Okay, and if you look at the same form again, I have another attribute called on submit, right? So this on submit attribute, what it's going to do is I have set a value called on submit, and you can see that this is in the form of a function, right? This is the name of a function. This is how you invoke a function. So when you click on submit, right? When you click on submit, it's going to invoke that particular function, right, in our JavaScript. So I have gone ahead and written the function out in JavaScript, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you another way to write this function. So I'm going to create a script tag, right? In a moment, script. Okay. What I'm going to do is within this function, within this script tag, I'm actually going to write this on submit function, right? So how do we define a function? We start off by saying function, function. Then we say the name for that function is on submit, right? Okay. Then we open it on the right hand side. Okay. We open the flower brackets. Now the first thing that we need to do here is we need to get, so when we click on this, this is what executes, right? So what we need to do is we need to do two things, right? So first is we need to hide this form, right? So let's go ahead and do that. How do we hide the form? We know we can do that by setting the display property to none. So we do have the ID of the form here, right? So let's go ahead and get document get element by ID of the name of the form is feedback hyphen form, right? And now I'm going to do dot style dot display is equal to none. Okay, and now if you come wait for it to load and you come back and see on the right hand side, you can see that the form is not hidden, right? It's only going to hide when you submit the form or when you click on this button. So let's go ahead and click on the button, right? And we can see that something else has happened, right? We can see that it now says backpath. Now, I'd just like to point out one small thing here, right? What's actually happened over there is that, just give me a moment, guys. I'm going to copy this very quickly and reload the page. Okay. So what's happened over there is that on on CodePen, it does not allow you to actually open or submit forms, right? So we need to prevent the default function from happening over there, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to come all the way down, and we're going to use a special JavaScript function called, here's a script, right? We're going to use a special JavaScript function called uh, event dot prevent default. So at this point of time, it's actually not going to go to a new URL like we saw before, right? So let's come down and let's click on submit, and we can see that nothing happens, right? And the reason for that is very simple, right? So when we create on submit, right? When we create on submit, just give me a moment. Okay, so there's a slightly different way that we need to tackle this, right? So we said document.get element by ID feedback form, right? Let's do it a slightly different way, right? Because this is a form, we have named it, right? The name of the form is feedback. So what I'm going to do is document.forms of, okay, feedback, right? Dot style dot I'm just going to refer to the code over here, right? Forms of feedback dot style dot display is equal to none, right? Feedback style dot display is equal to none, okay? And if you wait for that to load up, right, and scroll down to the bottom, okay, and click on submit over here, what's going to happen is that it's going to hide that particular form, right? Great. Now we have hidden the form, right? Now, there's one other thing that we need to do. We also need to show a message to the user on the right-hand side that says, "Hey, thank you for submitting the form. Thank you for leaving us your feedback. We need to acknowledge that it's been submitted, right?" And we do that in a very simple way, right? Now, JavaScript is excellent because you can do a lot of things with it, right? One of the things that you can do is dynamically add elements without having to go and edit your HTML document, right? So, for example, when someone submits the form, we can just add in a new element over there, right? That says, hey, thank you for submitting the form. So I'm actually going to copy this from here and I'll go over the code, right? So I'm going to paste this here. And this says document.body. Okay, so when JavaScript comes over this particular statement, it's going to say, hey, go to the document, right? Go to the body tag. And I want you to change the inner HTML for the body, right? And what I'm doing over here is I'm adding a plus equal to. So a plus equal to means that I'm going to add on whatever value is within this, right, to the end, or I'm going to append it at the end of the document, right? So within this brackets, what I've done is I've created a p tag with a class of subheading, right? And I have bolded that particular text by using the bold tag, right? And then I've said, hey, thank you for your feedback. I've closed the bold tag and then I've closed the paragraph tag. So if we submit this form right now, the first thing that it's going to do is it's going to prevent the form from being submitted, then the next thing that it's going to do is it's going to hide the form, and then it's going to say, hey, thank you for your feedback, right? So let's take a look at that. When I click on submit, it's hidden the form, and now it says, thank you for your feedback. Okay, great. Now, that does bring us to the end of this workshop. That does bring us to the end of this session. And I hope that you've learned a few things about how to build a website. I hope that you've learned about HTML. I hope that you've learned about CSS and about JavaScript. I will give you all the resources that we've worked on so far. I'll give you the links to all the code pens that we're working on so far. I'll give you a link to the presentation as well. And you can go through it and you can learn a little bit more in depth, right? Now, I'd just like to quickly point out a couple of other resources as well. you can visit this website called w3schools.com in order to look up other documentation regarding HTML, regarding CSS, and regarding JavaScript. And it's a very great resource, right? You can go through it if you have any doubts, if you have doubts regarding a certain tag, for example, or if you have doubts regarding a certain property, or if you have doubts regarding certain things that we've learned in JavaScript, like for loops or if conditions or something like that, then you can go through the W3 Schools website and kind of get a clear understanding of how it works. I hope you've enjoyed this workshop. I hope you've learned something useful, and I'll now hand it over to Chaitanya ma'am to ask me questions or to close the session.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Amogh. So participants, any questions, kindly post it in the chat box. Okay, so if there are no questions, I thank our resource person, Mr. Amogh Harish, for spending your valuable time with us on all the 3 days. And I will also like to thank our HOD sir, Dr. Ravikumar V, for giving us an opportunity to conduct the workshop in his absence. And last but not the least, I will also thank all the participants for participating in the workshop and making it a success. So thank you all. So before you leave, please fill the feedback link and the attendance link. Thank you one and all. Thank you, Amogh, again.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Amogh.
Thank you. Bye-bye.